Sorry about that, guys. I should be smarter about that now. And given that we're at the end of the year, I apologize for blasting your speakers. We've got our review session tonight. I'm hoping from the lack of questions that we have that you guys are feeling in a really good place. Tomorrow's test is on chapter 20, 37 and 38. 37 from Nixon's election on forward, and then 38 in its entirety. And then for the remainder of the time that we're going to be together over the next few weeks, leading up to the AP test, we'll be covering chapters 39, 40, and 41. We'll be doing a lot of that outside of class, though, and in class, we'll be doing a lot of building to get ready for the AP test. So we'll be doing some mix of direct instruction in class, but also a lot of writing instruction activities and so on to try to help you to get set to go with the testing itself. So the place where I'm seeing my questions is in period 4. If you post questions, I will be keeping my eyes open for that, so I'll be able to take care of those as they come in. But I'll start in period 4 then. Sam's got a question. What did SALT 2 do? And then Kirsten's asking a question. What was the situation in Carter's relationship with Russia? And with Jimmy Carter, the thing that you want to notice with the Carter presidency is Jimmy Carter's trying to figure out how to focus not just on Cold War, and he's trying to figure out where do we go from this point. Are we focusing on détente? Are we being tougher with the Russians? Jimmy Carter wants to focus on human rights, and so you learn about the Helsinki Accords with Jimmy Carter, where he is trying to put pressure on other countries to show respect for people for human rights. And we're going to find that for Jimmy Carter, this position is admirable, but he's not really going to be able to force change inside of countries like the Soviet Union when we don't really have any ability to militarily threaten them. And what we're going to find is that during Jimmy Carter's time, America gets a bad reputation for being soft with the aggression that's happening with the Russians. And so as a result of Jimmy Carter's presidency and Gerald Ford's presidency and the hangover that's coming on from the Vietnam War, the entire world understands that our foreign policy is in transition, and we're not certain how much we want to get involved in other countries. And so when we take a look at what Carter's relationship with Russia looks like, Jimmy Carter is trying to negotiate with Russia, focus on human rights in Helsinki, and then he's watching as in the Ford's presidency, the Russians are still trying to set up governments in places like Angola and Africa, Middle East, Asia. They're still trying to exert influence, and Jimmy Carter's not a big fan of that, but he realizes America doesn't want to get involved in another Vietnam War. He tries to create the SALT II treaty that's going to shrink our nuclear stockpile further, but there's pushback from hawks who are conservative, who are worried that Jimmy Carter is the wrong guy to be doing that, and that would send the message to the world that we are soft, and perhaps appeasing the Russians by cutting back our nuclear stockpiles. And so there's this pushback that happens against another SALT agreement, and so it's not going to be able to get done. So SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, is a treaty that's intended to try to shrink nuclear weapons stockpiles. The first one came during Nixon's presidency and passed. This one is not going to be passed. Sam, you've also got a question about Jimmy Carter's malaise speech. And Jimmy Carter's malaise speech is something that has got very different interpretations depending on if you are a conservative or if you are a liberal. Where if you look back at the text of Jimmy Carter's speech, his argument is that we are dependent on foreign oil, and that's leading to these crashes that we're having, where we're sending our money out of the country to get oil back from the Middle East, and the Middle East keeps cutting off our oil, creating these spikes. But Jimmy Carter's also going to argue that it's our dependence on oil that is making us so vulnerable during this time period. So he's arguing that we need to have like smaller cars and we should drive less, build infrastructure to build like mass transportation, or at least do carpooling. He's saying during the wintertime, maybe you shouldn't have like a comfortably warm house, but maybe your house should be in like the mid 60s and you should put on a sweater and socks to do your part as an American to cut back on our dependence on foreign oil. And then he also is talking about encouraging the development of oil reserves here inside the United States, as well as alternate energies like solar power and wind and ethanol and those sorts of things. So with Jimmy Carter's speech, initially it was received well, until the focus got pushed back on the idea that Jimmy Carter was telling Americans that our economic problems were things that we had brought on ourselves with the system of lifestyle that we've had, and that it's our job then to make sacrifices and change. For many conservatives, the argument that they make, though, is that this is indicating malaise. And what they're saying is that Jimmy Carter is talking about how bad America is, when the conservatives are going to point out the only thing bad about America is Jimmy Carter's policies. And they're going to argue that if we just went back to the good old days of conservative philosophies from like the 1920s, where we had less government spending and less government involvement and less regulation, if we returned to our morals like we had back during the 1920s, we wouldn't have any of the problems that were brought on by the previous few decades. And so what's going to happen with Carter's malaise speech is when the economy doesn't get better and we fail in the attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran, there's going to be this conservative wave that comes that helps Ronald Reagan get elected in one of the largest election victories in United States history. Kirsten, you've got a couple questions also. What was the Camp David Accords? That was a meeting between Israel and Egypt to discuss peace between these two countries. And so you've already studied the 6 Days War and the Yom Kippur War, where Israel and Egypt went to war with one another, and Egypt made alliances with other Arab nations that were nearby. This peace treaty is going to bring relative peace to the Middle East over the Israel issue, although many people in the Middle East will still have resentment towards Israel. But this treaty will bring peace for a couple decades between Egypt and Israel, and it's going to be one of the lasting legacies of Jimmy Carter's presidency that he really is proud of when he leaves the presidency. For Nixon's Philadelphia plan, this is a quota system to put into place affirmative action for people who are trying to do work for the United States government. And so what Nixon puts into place is this announcement that if a business wants to do construction work for the United States government, they need to have in place a quota system that will then demonstrate timelines and strategies that they are using to diversify their workforce, to make their workforce look more like the American demographics rather than having them be an all-white workforce. And so this is a plan by Nixon to advance civil rights further. And so he's a very complicated individual because we've taken a look at elements of Nixon that shows him pushing back to resist the movement in some directions with civil rights, especially busing. But we're going to see also what Nixon is doing with his Philadelphia plan is advancing civil rights. And so we'll find that he is not somebody who's easily put into a box on the issue of civil rights. Meg's got a question about the Nixon Doctrine. And the Nixon Doctrine has two terms you'll want to be able to use. There's a European term, realpolitik, realpolitik. It's all one word. And realpolitik is the idea that you're doing foreign policy not based on ideally what you think America should be. So like when you hear people talk about America being the greatest country on the face of the planet, there's nobody better. That's great as propaganda. And there's certain facts that allow people to make an argument like that. But once that drifts into foreign policy with the idea that you can invade any country and feel assured that the war will be done in like 6 months because we're so super, Vietnam and Korea have shown us that that's not the way that modern wars work. During the Cold War, especially when our enemies are pumping supplies into the countries that we're trying to fight. So realpolitik means we're not going to be doing foreign policy based on the ideal that America is great. We're going to be instead taking a realistic look at foreign policy. And with realpolitik, this leads us into the Nixon Doctrine, where it says we're going to honor all the agreements that we've made so far. But from this point forward, if a country enters into a war or feels threatened, we're not just going to jump in because they're fearing communism. We're instead going to determine, is there any national security reason for America to be involved in this place? And if the answer is no, we're not going in. And it's with the idea that it's great to help out other countries, but once we get bogged down in a Vietnam or in a Korea, it's really hard to get out. And then also, other countries around the world know that when we're bogged down in those places, we can't get involved in other places because there's limits on our wealth and our military. And so he wants to recognize that. He is also, in his Nixon doctrine, focusing on détente, a decreasing of tensions between America and communist countries, especially between America and the Soviet Union and America and China, with the ambition of hopefully trying to resume trade, but then also to try to split North Vietnam away from their allies to see if we can figure out a way to end the Vietnam War. Let me see here. Matthew's got a question. How much do we need to know about the Watergate situation? With Watergate, you need to know about what the initial crime was. You need to understand what was going on with the attempts to try to impede the investigation. And so there are terms like the Saturday Night Massacre, where Richard Nixon fires his attorney. He attempts to put pressure on the special prosecutor who's investigating him, and so he has multiple people in his Justice Department that are going to step down rather than fire the independent prosecutor because they're afraid that would make them guilty. You'd want to know about the 18.5 minute gap on the tapes and the court case U.S. v. Nixon, where Richard Nixon tried to sue to prevent the release of information to Congress about the break-ins, especially the Watergate tapes. You also want to be able to speak about Woodward and Bernstein. These are two journalists who are working for the Washington Post. And you want to be able to talk about the role of media that was used to put a light on what Richard Nixon was doing in the middle of this situation. For Watergate, your other key things to know about are these things. Nixon was on the verge of being impeached, but not impeached in 1974. And what he was in trouble for was not the initial crime itself at Watergate, because of the fact that he was not directly responsible for that break-in. It was his plumbers that were worried about leaks coming from, like, the Pentagon Papers that caused them to be paranoid about leaks. But for Richard Nixon, he got in trouble for the cover-up, for obstruction of justice, where he was destroying evidence and trying to lie to prosecutors and other sorts of things to hide what he knew about during that time. You also need to know about Spiro Agnew, his vice president, being forced from the vice presidency because of his own criminal behavior, and Gerald Ford being the only unelected president ever because the presidency was about to be emptied. No president, no vice president, and they didn't want to go through the order of succession to move down further beyond that point. Matthew, your next question, how do wiretaps work? It's pretty simple. So if you imagine a telephone, in the old days, telephones, like handset telephones, had two end caps on the earpiece and on the mouthpiece. And what you can do is you can unscrew them, and then they had a microphone mechanism and a speaker mechanism inside them. A wiretap would be an electronic device that you could put into either one of those two openings in the handset or in the phone itself, or a microphone that would work as a bug inside the room, so that whenever somebody used the telephone or other sorts of things in the room, you would then be able to listen in or record the conversations, so you could use that against those individuals later on. Let me see here, Matthew. The next question that you've got is, can I re-explain stagflation? And so the way to think about it simply is, when we talked about economic crashes way back when, we talked about the idea, sorry, intense close-up. We talked about economic curve that looked like this. And what we had always talked about was the idea that when the economy takes a dip, that means the economy is becoming stagnant. It's not the money is not moving. People are not spending. People are hoarding. People are struggling. People are getting laid off from their jobs. The typical thing that happens, though, with a stagnant economy is oftentimes it follows a distinct pattern. So think back to our Steel Empire game. And in the Steel Empire game, when the economy crashed, at least you had the benefit of knowing that the prices of everything would drop simultaneously, because of the fact that people stopped buying. Demand went away. People lost their jobs. They were panicking. They wouldn't buy stuff, and so prices would just go down. In stagflation, though, you've got a stagnant economy, but at the same time, prices are rising. And the reason why prices are rising is because of two different things. The first reason why prices are rising is when we talk about demand, Demand is just people buying stuff, but it doesn't have to be people buying things. And so what we're going to find with stagflation is, sure, regular everyday people are going to stop buying stuff. The government didn't, though. And so when the economy started going bad, people started hoarding their money, but the government is still spending a lot of money on Great Society programs. It's around this time period that you have some people starting to really start utilizing Social Security, and so that program starts ramping up quite a bit. And so the government is spending tons of money on what we call butter programs, or domestic programs that are meant to aid people in doing their day-to-day stuff. The problem we also had was the Vietnam War was in full swing, and that spending didn't stop. We had been escalating throughout the war. And so we have plenty of demand, which means these prices keep rising, even though you've got people in danger of losing their jobs, and they've stopped spending their money. The other thing that's causing prices to go up is those oil shocks that you had. And so when oil prices start going up because of the oil embargoes that you have, you're going to have then stagflation. You're going to have the price of everything go up because of the fact that everything in our country requires oil. And so much so, you're going to recognize, if you ever do any world traveling, when you go to Europe, their cars and trucks are really small. Many of them are living in neighborhoods that are still like the 16, 17, and 1800s, where you can still walk wherever you want to go get the necessities of life. Virtually no place in America is like that anymore. We now got so used to the cars with our suburbs and spread out areas that if you want to go to the grocery store, that's pretty much a multi-mile drive. And if you try to do that during the wintertime here in Minnesota, it's going to be rough. And so nobody can really avoid going using oil. And people still have their basic necessities, but now all of their necessities will become more expensive. Tractors require expensive gasoline. That price will be passed on to consumers. If you buy anything from the store, the same deal. And suddenly, all of these products that were cheaper now become more expensive, which means there's other products in our economy that people stop buying because of the fact that they're now seen as extras rather than necessities. The other thing that's killing Americans is the fact that we fell in love with the idea that there was an American way of doing things, and we didn't want to change. So in the 1960s and 70s, our factories are starting to become 30 to 40 years old after World War II is done. And when we think about our cars, they're gigantic and beautiful, but they're gas guzzlers. And compared to Germany and Japan, what Germany and Japan start doing is they start sending us fuel-efficient cars, whether it's the Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz coming from over in Europe. Japan's sending Toyotas, Nissans, Mazdas, and those sorts of cars are coming from Japan and other Asian countries. And they start beating Americans because a lot of Americans start buying fuel-efficient cars rather than big gas guzzler cars, and that causes a bunch of American factories to struggle. They start laying off workers, and so that it's this whole negative trend that starts up in the 1970s that becomes known as stagflation. And your big problem that you have with stagflation is our old way of doing things. Like when the economy would crash, we would talk about trying to do things to stimulate the economy, but if we do government spending right here, we've already been doing that, and the economy is lagging, which means it could make inflation worse. If we cut taxes, people are going to have more money in their pocket, which means inflation could get worse, and there's no guarantee that people are going to spend that money to turn the economy around. So that's why you've got people like Milton Friedman with his more conservative perspective, who's going to make the argument the government has screwed all of this stuff up with their military spending and their Great Society programs. They're the ones who are to blame for the rampant inflation of the time period, which has some elements of truth to it, but also it's helping some people who are deeply impoverished to be able to move their way up. And we are in a Cold War that we are not willing to cave in on. And it's ignoring the fact that oil prices are beyond the scope of the Great Society, and it's something that's big picture, a global impact on our economy. But I'm getting long-winded now. So when we start moving in the 1980s and beyond, you're going to find that the 1970s had a huge impact on our politics and our viewpoints, and we're going to have a significant change then afterwards as far as how we view the world and politics from that point forward. I don't see any more period 4 questions, so hopefully you guys are doing good. Period 2, I still see no questions. Period 6, Dylan, I see your question. What caused the inflation of the 1970s? I'm hoping that my explanation of government spending plus oil price, the oil shocks that we had, is the thing that's causing inflation to go so crazy during this time period. Um, if you have any other questions then about that topic, we can definitely talk before class. I'm going to do one more flyby through each of my classes. I don't see any more questions for period 6. Period 4, I see none. And period 2 posted none, so I'm assuming that you guys are in great shape, and the test tomorrow is going to go well for you. Test tomorrow is 25 questions, and so once we get finished up with that, we will be wrapping up, taking a look at the civil rights movements of the 60s, activity that you were working on with schools, taking a look at what impact Nixon had on the desegregation efforts, in particular with busing, and then we will be fully ready to move into the 1980s starting tomorrow. I hope your weekend went well. If you were celebrating religiously this weekend, I hope that you are feeling fulfilled. And I'm excited to get back to you guys for the final 3-week sprint before we get to our AP test. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you tomorrow.